a handshake with death, or something far stranger. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Your voice shapes this channel. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Hearing from you makes every case come alive. Now, into the story. It was on a bleak February morning that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street, soot-speckled light filtering through the fog that hung thick over London like an old shroud. Outside, the clip-clop of hooves was muffled by slush, and a coal cart rattled past with a melancholy rhythm. Within, the crackling fire and scent of tobacco created a haven of comfort, one I was only too happy to share with the most singular mind I have ever encountered, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, his long, slender fingers steepled beneath his chin, a far-off gleam in his eyes that suggested the workings of a complex mental calculation. I had only just laid down my medical journal when a knock came at the door. Not the brisk rap of the post nor the hesitating knock of a patient, but a sharp, agitated tattoo. Before Mrs. Hudson could ascend the stairs, Holmes had risen with alacrity and opened the door himself. A man stood framed in the doorway, his breath misting in the cold air. He was middle-aged, tall but stooped, and wore the unmistakable garb of a country physician, a faded frock coat, creased trousers, and gloves still wet from the rain. His spectacles were fogged, and his expression was one of desperation held just barely in check. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, breathless. Holmes nodded. "Do come in, sir. You appear to be in haste, and not from the weather." The man entered, glancing about nervously as if pursued by some unseen spectre. "I am Dr. Horace Pritchard, Superintendent of Ravenscar Asylum. I come to you in utmost urgency. A man was found dead last night, one of our inmates, under circumstances I can only describe as impossible." "Impossible is merely a word used by those whose imaginations have failed them," Holmes murmured, gesturing toward the fire. "Please, sit. You have the look of a man who has not slept." Pritchard sat heavily, and with good reason. The man was found inside his locked cell, untouched, unmarked, save for a strange discoloration on his right palm. It resembled a burn, but cold, almost frostbitten. And yet he had not cried out. No one heard a sound. And here's the worst of it, Mr. Holmes. The man died smiling as though he had just made a terrible peace. Holmes leaned forward. "Curious." "The constabulary dismissed it as heart failure," Pritchard continued, "but I have been in my position for 17 years, and I have seen madness in every shade. This was something else. His name was Josiah Lavington. He had not spoken a word in 12 years. "Yet you say he smiled at death," Holmes murmured. "An asylum, a mute, and a burn on the palm? Yes, there is something here." Dr. Pritchard produced a folded document from his coat. "This was found in his mattress. I did not inform the police." Holmes took the note with delicate care. It was a scrap of aged stationery, torn at the corners, and written in a spidery hand. The words were few, but chilling. He came at last, and I knew him by his grip. "Death has a hand like ice and a voice I remember." Holmes read it twice, then handed it silently to me. As I scanned the short message, a shiver ran down my spine. "Doctor?" Holmes said slowly. "How secure was the cell?" "Absolutely," Pritchard insisted. "Bolted from the outside, one key, mine, a barred window far too narrow for any human to pass through. There is no conceivable way anyone entered or exited without detection." Holmes steepled his fingers again. "Then perhaps we must consider the inconceivable." For a moment, there was only the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Holmes stood, his tone brisk and decisive. Watson, pack a bag. We depart for Yorkshire by the evening train. I should very much like to see the room where a man shook hands with death. The journey to Yorkshire was conducted in silence for the greater part. Holmes reclined in the corner of the compartment with his eyes closed, fingertips pressed together and his brow furrowed as though in meditation. Only the gentle rhythm of the train on the tracks accompanied us, the countryside passing in greys and whites through the fogged glass. I had brought along my medical bag, as Holmes had suggested. Not for stitching wounds, Watson, but perhaps for reading souls. And I carried it now beside me, as I reviewed once more the strange message found in the dead man's mattress. Holmes had barely spoken of it since leaving Baker Street, but I could not banish the words from my mind. Death has a hand like ice, and a voice I remember. The phrasing was unmistakably poetic, which seemed at odds with a man who had not spoken in over a decade. And then there was the matter of the smile. Night had fallen by the time we arrived at the small station near Ravenscar. A chill wind met us on the platform, and a carriage was waiting, its lanterns barely illuminating the driver's gloved hands and the steaming breath of the horses. Dr. Pritchard emerged from the shadows with his collar turned up and a nervous glance over his shoulder. "This way, gentlemen," he said, helping us into the carriage. "It isn't far." The road twisted upward, flanked by barren trees and dry stone walls. Eventually, through the mist, the asylum loomed into view, a sombre structure of grey stone, with narrow slit windows and a square tower that looked more suited to a medieval fortress than a place of healing. A solitary lamp burned near the entrance. Inside, the warmth was minimal, and the air carried the faint scent of antiseptic and aged wood. Pritchard led us through the main hall, where a nurse in starched uniform nodded respectfully, and then down a corridor lined with locked doors. "We keep the more troubled cases in this wing," he explained. "Lavington's cell is the last on the left." Holmes examined each door as we passed, noting without comment the heavy bolts and iron grills. At the final door, Pritchard produced his key, hesitating only a second before unlocking it. The room was small, spare, and chillingly neat. A narrow cot, a threadbare rug, and a barred window too high for even a tall man to reach. Holmes stepped inside immediately and crouched by the mattress. "This is where the note was hidden?" he asked. Yes, between the stuffing and the canvas. It was sewn shut, but I noticed a bulge during routine inspection. Holmes examined the seams and the cot frame, his magnifying lens flashing under the flickering gaslight. He sniffed the fabric, ran his fingers along the bedposts, and then turned his attention to the floor. The wooden planks were clean, though marked with the scratches of a chair one frequently moved. "There were no signs of struggle?" Holmes asked. "None," Pritchard replied. The nurse on duty heard nothing, and the night warden reported no disturbance. Holmes stood and moved toward the door, examining the inside lock. "This bolt, can it be operated from within?" "No, Mr. Holmes, it is fixed from the outside only. The walls are solid. There's no passage or hatch. It is, in every sense, a locked room." "And yet the man died." Holmes's voice was low and thoughtful. "Watson, what do you make of this discoloration?" I examined the physician's notes and the sketch of the body's right hand. The skin on the palm exhibits signs of contact burn and unnatural blanching, yet the surrounding tissue is not consistent with thermal exposure, more akin to chemical frostbite. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely, Doctor. Do you keep any cryogenic substances in this facility?" "Certainly not. We have basic compounds for cleaning and medicinal storage, but nothing remotely that cold, and the body was found well after midnight. No one had entered that room since lights out." Holmes turned to Pritchard. "Who else had access to the keys?" "Only myself and Nurse Evelyn Corrick. but she's been with us 12 years. Loyal, dependable. Holmes glanced at me briefly, then motioned us back into the corridor. He closed the door gently behind him and walked a few paces away, gesturing for us to follow. "There is something wrong with the narrative," he murmured. "A man locked away for 12 years, mute and unresponsive, suddenly dies with a smile on his face and leaves behind a note in poetic language, a note sewn into his own bedding, no less, suggesting premeditation and intent. That does not fit the profile of an inert, mindless patient." Pritchard frowned. "Are you suggesting Lavington was not truly insane?" "I suggest he may not have always been so," Holmes replied, his eyes bright. "What was his original diagnosis?" "Delusional paranoia with episodes of catatonia. He was committed after being found wandering the streets, raving about a man who shook hands with death. The phrase struck me at the time. It's what made yesterday's message so disturbing." "Indeed," said Holmes, pausing. "What became of the attending physician who approved his committal?" Pritchard hesitated. "Dr. Vernon Arkwright. He retired shortly afterward. Lives in a village near Scarborough, I believe. I can make inquiries." "Do so immediately," Holmes instructed. "I must speak with him." We returned to the administrative wing, where Holmes requested access to the asylum's patient records. While he pored over Lavington's file, carefully copied notes in neat script, I wandered to the window, staring out into the fog that clung to the ground like an accusation. Something about Lavington's story troubled me deeply. A man declared mad for raving about a figure of death, only to be found dead, years later, in precisely that manner. At last Holmes closed the file and stood. "We shall stay the night. I want to see the changing of the watch and the sequence of corridor patrols, and I should like to interview Nurse Corrick." "Of course," said Pritchard, though uneasily. "There is a guest room upstairs. I'll have a cot prepared." An hour later, Holmes and I sat in the guest quarters, where he resumed his silent posture, fingertips pressed together, eyes shut in thought. "You suspect foul play from within the asylum," I said. "Not exactly," Holmes replied, his voice calm. "The true question, Watson, is not how Lavington died, but why now? What occurred after 12 years of silence to cause him to leave a note and meet his end with a smile?" A knock came at the door. It was Nurse Corrick. She was a plain, sharp-featured woman of perhaps 50, with the stiff posture of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. Yet her voice was calm, her words precise. "I was the last to see Mr. Lavington alive," she said. "He took his evening meal without incident. He never spoke, never acknowledged me, just sat on the edge of the bed looking at the wall." Holmes nodded. "And yet you say nothing felt different?" She frowned. "Nothing. Except, well, he had a habit, strange really, of folding his hands when he sat. But last night he kept his right hand resting on the mattress, as though expecting someone to take it." Holmes's eyes glittered. "As though waiting for a handshake?" "Yes," she said softly. "But I put it out of my mind. We see many things in here that make little sense." "On the contrary," Holmes said, rising, "every gesture has meaning, especially in silence." After she left, Holmes lit his pipe and stood by the window, gazing into the night. "Watson," he said, "I believe Josiah Lavington was not merely a patient. He was a witness." "To what?" Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "To a murder. And the murderer has come, after 12 years, to silence him." We stared at one another, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. Somewhere far below in that grim asylum, a door creaked softly in the dark. Holmes did not sleep that night, and neither did I. The next morning dawned grey and grudging. A thin mist clung to the moorland beyond Ravenscar Asylum, giving the bleak countryside a ghostly hue. Holmes had slept not a wink, and I suspect even if he had attempted it, his restless mind would not have allowed it. When I awoke, he was already seated by the guest-room hearth, cross-legged and immersed in silent contemplation. "Something must have shifted," he said without preamble. "Something occurred within these walls, or without, that stirred Lavington's memory after all these years." "What are you implying, Holmes?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "That either a face from his past has returned, or news of an old event has reached his ears. In either case, it reawakened something long buried." At breakfast, Dr. Pritchard appeared worn and fretful. "I've sent a telegram to Dr. Arkwright's residence in Scarborough. His housekeeper confirmed he's home and willing to receive you this afternoon." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "Before we depart, however, I wish to examine something else." Pritchard led us to a room behind the administrative wing, a modest archive where decades of patient records were kept in labelled boxes. Holmes began sifting through the files with astonishing speed, eyes darting over lines of ink with laser focus. Within half an hour, he had separated 3 folders. "Watson," he said, handing me one, "tell me what these 3 have in common." I read quickly. Each file detailed the case of a man admitted between 1882 and 1884, all showing symptoms of delusional fear, all diagnosed as chronic, and all, curiously, committed after uttering nearly identical phrases. He shook my hand, or the hand was like ice, and once, "He's come back." I looked up at Holmes. "You believe these men all saw the same figure?" "I believe they all believed they had," Holmes said grimly. "And what is more curious, they were all transferred here from different counties, different doctors, same pattern. One of them died here in 1885, the others discharged or moved, but the commonality is too strong for coincidence." "You think this is more than a shared delusion?" I asked. "I think it is a shared experience, Watson, and I think it terrified them into madness." Just before noon, we hired a trap and drove to the coastal town of Scarborough, where Dr. Vernon Arkwright lived in a narrow terrace overlooking the sea. He received us in a parlour that smelled faintly of laudanum and old paper, the furnishings neat but tired. Dr. Arkwright was in his 70s now, a slight man with rheumy eyes and liver-spotted hands. He greeted Holmes with a slow nod. "You come about Lavington?" he said, without waiting for confirmation. Holmes inclined his head. "You remember him then?" "Not easily. We had many patients. But I remember that name because of the peculiar nature of his committal. He wasn't violent, not even particularly disordered in appearance, but he said the same thing over and over: the man who shakes hands with death is real, and he will come again." "And what led to his being institutionalized?" Holmes asked. Arkwright sighed. "He was a schoolteacher from Lincolnshire, a quiet man, the sort you'd never notice at a gathering. But one day he was found wandering the moors, raving, dishevelled. His neighbours said he'd changed almost overnight. I suspected some trauma or drug use at first, but there was nothing in his blood work. What convinced me was his eyes. He wasn't pretending." "You believed he had seen something?" I asked. "I believed he had survived something," Arkwright replied softly. "Though what, I never could determine." "Did he ever speak of names?" Holmes asked. "Anyone he feared? Or accused?" "No, only that he had shaken hands with death. He said it in a tone of wonder, not fear, not grief, wonder, as though he couldn't believe he was still alive." Holmes fell into silence, then stood. "Thank you, Doctor. You've been of great help." As we stepped outside, the wind from the sea cut through our coats. "Do you believe him, Holmes?" I asked. Holmes's gaze was distant. "I believe Lavington saw something that night 12 years ago." something he knew would return. And now it has. We returned to the asylum just as dusk was falling. Nurse Corrick met us in the hallway, pale and breathless. "Mr. Holmes, something's happened," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Another patient. He's missing." "What?" Pritchard barked, appearing behind her. "Who?" "Patient, Juror 42, Eric Barstow. He was stable, kept mostly to himself. Harmless, but he's gone. His cell was locked, but the nurse making rounds noticed the room was wrong. The bedclothes undisturbed, but the man vanished." Holmes was already moving. "Take me to the cell." The room was similar to Lavington's, bare walls, a barred window, a single cot. But there was something undeniably off. No signs of struggle, no signs of escape. Yet no human being remained. Holmes scanned the room, his eyes pausing at the pillow. "Watson!" I stepped forward and followed his gaze. On the white linen, just visible in the fading light, was the outline of a handprint, slightly grey, slightly damp, and oddly chilled to the touch. He turned to Pritchard. "Where are your patient logs? I want to see everyone who had access to this corridor in the last 48 hours. "I'll fetch them," Pritchard said, clearly shaken. When he was gone, Holmes crouched by the bed and whispered more to himself than to me. 2 disappearances. 1 man dead, 1 gone without a trace. Both linked by the same idea. A cold hand. A visitor that moves undetected. An intruder only the mad seem to recognize. "What could it mean, Holmes?" I asked. "Are we dealing with someone using chemical methods? Chloroform? Ether? Something that leaves no trace?" Holmes stood slowly. "I do not believe Barstow was taken by chemical force. I believe he followed someone or something of his own will. But why? Because I think he recognized the visitor. And I think the visitor said something to him that no sane man could ignore." A silence settled between us. Then Holmes said, "We must identify who has been entering these cells, not just by the logs, but in reality. There may be someone in this asylum with keys they should not possess." He turned to me abruptly. "Watson, tonight you and I shall take turns watching this corridor. If our phantom comes again, we shall see him with our own eyes." And so it was that by midnight I stood just outside the hallway junction, my revolver in my coat pocket and my nerves taut as piano wire. Holmes had gone to fetch something from the carriage, a device, he said, to test for lingering chemical vapours. I was alone. The corridor stretched out before me, lit by intermittent gas lamps that left broad patches of shadow. All was silent. And then a footstep, soft, measured. I turned toward it, heart pounding. A figure was emerging from the far end of the hallway, tall, pale. I opened my mouth to challenge him and then froze. The figure did not walk so much as glide. There was something unnatural about the gait, something off in the way the limbs moved. Too fluid, too deliberate. The gaslight flickered as it passed beneath one of the lamps, and I saw its hand. White. Gloved. Or was it? A chill struck me. The figure paused before the empty cell. Then, with a slow and deliberate gesture, it extended its hand, open, as if in greeting, to the empty room. And then it turned, not toward me, but toward the wall, as if waiting for someone else. I took a step forward. "Who are you?" I said, my voice unsteady. The figure did not reply. It simply turned and disappeared into shadow, as though it had never been there at all. Moments later, Holmes rounded the corner behind me. I turned to him, my face pale. "Holmes, I saw it." He said nothing, but I saw the faintest flicker of something rare in his eyes. Fear. Holmes did not speak for a long moment. His eyes searched my face, keenly studying the color of my cheeks, the pitch of my breath, the tremor in my fingers. At last, he asked quietly. You are certain? Absolutely, I replied, trying to steady my voice. It was no hallucination, Holmes. A figure. Human in shape, but not in motion. There was something unnatural in its walk, in the way it simply vanished. It extended its hand toward the empty cell. I swear it, Holmes, it greeted the room. Holmes said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten ever so slightly. He stepped past me into the corridor, examining the ground with the aid of his lens. The gas lamps flickered as he passed under them, casting long shadows against the pale walls. There, he said suddenly. He crouched beside the cell door, pointing at a faint smudge on the floor, barely perceptible but elongated, a darkening against the stone. A footprint? I asked, leaning in. No, he replied, and not in the conventional sense. This is not made by a boot. This is just a condensation, like a chill pressed briefly against the stone. He stood and faced me, all signs of disbelief gone. We are no longer dealing with questions of if, but of how. We must consider that the person or thing that appeared tonight is real, is tangible, and yet possesses means of movement beyond what conventional locks and bolts can restrict. He turned abruptly and began walking. Come, Watson, we must speak with Nurse Corrick again. We found her in the infirmary, tending to an elderly patient. Her eyes widened when Holmes entered. Nurse, he said without preamble, tell me, do any of the patients report nightly visitors? She blinked. Well, patients in this ward are often incoherent, but there are murmurs. Yes, one man, Samuel Leach, speaks often of a visitor he calls the man in the grey fog. Leach? Where is he kept? Room 17, North Wing. Without another word, Holmes spun on his heel, and we followed him through a narrow corridor toward the North Wing. As we approached, the air seemed colder, the light dimmer. Leach's room was at the end of the hallway, and the man inside sat rocking gently on the edge of his bed, muttering to himself. He was small and hunched, his skin drawn tight across his skull. His eyes, however, were bright and alert, alive with something deeper than madness. As Holmes entered, Leach stopped rocking. I knew you'd come, the man said, looking not at Holmes but somewhere past him. He always comes first, then you follow. You always do. Holmes stepped forward slowly. Mr. Leach, may I speak with you? Leach nodded, his gaze still far away. I saw him again last night. He touched Barstow's door. Barstow followed him. They always follow when the hand reaches out. Always. Holmes lowered himself to one knee, his tone measured and respectful. This man? Describe him for me. Leach smiled, his teeth yellow and crooked. Tall, always tall, face like mist. He knocks but never speaks, never has to. He shows them what they lost and they walk away. Holmes leaned in. What do you mean, what they lost? Leach turned to him at last. He shows them the moment they regret the most, holds it out like a prize. If they reach for it, they go with him, and they never come back. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he stood and turned to me. We must revisit Lavington's past. I want to know what regret haunted him. What moment might have bound him to this so-called man in the grey fog? We spent the rest of the morning poring through Lavington's earlier personal effects. Pritchard had kept a box of patient belongings stored away, small things confiscated for safety or retrieved from relatives who never came. Among Lavington's were an old leather-bound book of poetry, a snapped chalk holder, and a faded photograph. Holmes picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long time. It was of a woman, young, dark-haired, elegant in a modest Victorian dress. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes shadowed by the tint of age. There's something familiar here, Holmes muttered. Pritchard peered over his shoulder. That was found sewn into his coat lining when he was first admitted. We assumed it was a relative. A sister, perhaps? Holmes handed the photograph to me. On the back was scrawled in faded ink, Catherine, the last word I never spoke. I dare say, Holmes murmured, we have our regret. He strode back to the guest room with the photograph in hand and placed it on the desk. Watson, this is no ordinary madness. This is an organized response to emotional guilt. Lavington, and perhaps others, were burdened by a moment of personal failure, something they would give anything to undo. If Leach is to be believed, this entity, or impersonator thereof, preys upon that. But to what end, Holmes? I asked. A murderer who tricks the insane into death, a spectre from their past? Are we not drifting toward the fantastical? He turned and gave me a sharp look. Watson, when I say I do not believe in the supernatural, I say so with conviction. Therefore, the explanation, however improbable, must lie in the material world. A physical presence capable of movement within the asylum, access to the patients, an intimate knowledge of their regrets. He paused. We are dealing with a manipulator, a master of suggestion, possibly hypnosis. Hypnosis? Yes. Consider, what if someone has been posing as this man in the grey fog, appearing under the veil of night, whispering the right words, placing the right suggestion in their ears? The patients, fragile in mind and burdened by their past, respond not by force but by belief. They leave willingly, perhaps even destroy themselves, convinced they are correcting an ancient wrong. But how could this person enter and exit these rooms without notice? That, Holmes said grimly, is our next puzzle. That night we prepared again for watch, but this time Holmes did not remain idle. From his bag he withdrew a small device, a square metal box with a glass gauge. A barometric trigger, he said. It will register even the smallest change in pressure near the door. If someone enters without opening it, conventionally through a hidden panel or passage, we'll see the effect. I watched the corridor from midnight until 2. Then Holmes took over. At precisely 3:30 in the morning, I was roused by his knock. "Watson," he said urgently, "come quickly." We entered the corridor outside Leach's room. Holmes pointed to the device. The needle had jumped. "No sound," he whispered. No step. But someone or something entered. He turned the knob on Leach's door slowly. Inside, the old man was sitting bolt upright in bed. His eyes were wide open, and in his lap was another photograph. Holmes stepped forward and took it gently. It showed a young boy, no more than 10, sitting on a riverbank, fishing rod in hand, sunlight dancing on the water. Leach whispered. He showed it to me. The last day before my brother drowned, he let me see it again. Told me I could change it if I went with him. Holmes said nothing. But I saw something harden in his eyes. He held up the photograph to the light, and at the very bottom, in faint pencil, was the same signature found in Lavington's note. M.E.C. Holmes exhaled slowly. "We have a name?" "Who?" I asked. Holmes's voice was quiet. "Maurice Copley, a name I have not heard in 12 years, but I remember it well. A stage mesmerist turned fraud and vanisher. And you think he's here? I think he never left." The name hung in the air like the final note of a funeral bell. Maurice Copley. I knew it, of course, had heard Holmes mention it once or twice in the past, with the particular distaste he reserved for those who misused intellect to prey upon the vulnerable. A stage performer in the 1880s, Copley had built his reputation not on sleight of hand, but on the eerie precision with which he plumbed the audience's fears and regrets. He claimed no supernatural powers, only the art of suggestion and neural manipulation, a term that had earned him acclaim among fashionable spiritualists and quiet horror among physicians. But then, as Holmes recounted in a low voice while we walked the silent asylum halls, Copley had overstepped. He began performing private sessions, Holmes said, for the bereaved, for the broken, promised them glimpses of the past, relief from pain. But one woman died of shock during one of his sessions. Her husband accused Copley of inducing a waking trance from which she never returned. He vanished before the inquiry could proceed. "And you believe he's here?" I asked. "In this asylum?" "Not as a patient," Holmes replied. "As something far more dangerous, as a presence, a visitor behind the locked doors, a manipulator moving unseen." We returned to the guest room where Holmes spread several items across the writing desk. Lavington's photo, the second found in Leach's lap, and the scribbled note from the mattress. "Look closely, Watson. All three have the same signature, M.C. Barely, visible as if signed for the dead alone. These are tokens, calling cards." He tapped the photo of the boy. "How would Leach have obtained this? No one brought it to him. No staff member entered. And yet it appeared during the hour the corridor registered a barometric disturbance." "So Copley is entering these cells, but how?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we must now determine." At first light, Holmes called for Pritchard and requested a full structural diagram of the building. "Copley must be moving within walls through passages not listed on your standard floor plans. Ravenscar is over a century old. Many of these old asylums were built with hidden corridors, observation slots, emergency access for staff, or even priest holes. They brought the plans to the administrative office, faded blueprints rolled into tight cylinders, brittle with age. Holmes unrolled them carefully, eyes darting across inked outlines with quick intensity. "Here," he murmured, pointing to the western wing. "There's an 8-foot void between 2 rows of cells, no explanation, a blank wall on both sides." Pritchard peered closer. "That's behind the older patient block. Those rooms are rarely used." "Yet they are adjacent to every patient who has disappeared or seen the man in the fog," Holmes said. "I want access to that space immediately." We descended into the bowels of the asylum, where the western wing bore the weight of disuse. Rusted grates, dust-choked sconces, a smell of old mould and chemical disinfectant long dried. The ward was unoccupied, the doors bolted shut and cobwebbed. At the far end of the corridor, Holmes paused before a panel of wallboard. "This plaster is newer," he said. "See the nails? Replaced within the last 2 years." He drew a small blade from his pocket and tapped gently. A hollow thump answered. Holmes turned to Pritchard. "Fetch a crowbar." With effort, the board was pried away to reveal a narrow passage, a claustrophobic space that smelled of dry dust and faint chemicals. We squeezed inside single file, our lantern casting eerie shadows across soot-streaked brick and ancient timbers. Holmes led the way, counting steps aloud. "Directly behind cell 11 now. Cell 12. This should correspond to Lavington's room." He stopped. A small wooden door, narrow and expertly built to blend with the wall, stood before us. It bore no knob, only a small push plate. Holmes pressed it. The door gave way to reveal a hidden compartment, small, dark, and shockingly organized. A stool, a shelf, a peephole drilled clean through to Lavington's room, and on the shelf, a bundle of photographs carefully tied with twine. Holmes untied it with steady fingers. "Each of them marked," he whispered. "Different subjects, different regrets." One showed a wedding, the bride's face scratched out. Another, a battlefield. Another, a charred cottage. A catalogue of pain carefully curated. "And here," Holmes said, drawing out a thin black notebook, Inside, pages of spidery handwriting, dates, times, names of patients, and notes, leech, fixated on brother's drowning, try lakeside imagery, Lavington, guilt over Catherine, hand will be enough, whisper name, then retreat, Barstow, receptive, suspect, near breaking, revisit second time. The list went on. Holmes snapped the notebook shut. He's been studying them, manipulating them with surgical precision, returning again and again. This man has turned regret into a scalpel. A sound echoed behind us. We spun, lantern raised. From the far end of the tunnel came a soft tread, then a voice, smooth, even, familiar in its cadence, yet hollow, as if heard through a dream. "You're earlier than I expected, Mr. Holmes." A figure stepped into the dim arc of light. He was tall and thin, dressed not in asylum garb, but in a dark waistcoat and cravat. His features were angular, his skin pale, but it was his eyes that chilled me, wide, calm, and utterly devoid of guilt. "Maurice Copley," Holmes said. The man smiled faintly. "Still practicing the art of intrusion, I see." Holmes stepped between me and the corridor. "You have murdered at least one man, possibly more. You've preyed on the minds of the ill and grieving. You will answer for it." Copley tilted his head. "You call it murder, I call it release." "They wanted to leave, Holmes. I simply offered the door." "Through coercion," Holmes spat. "Through honesty," Copley replied. "What did your Dr. Pritchard offer them? Years locked in rooms, unacknowledged, forgotten? I offered them a memory, a last glimpse of a moment they failed to keep. Is that not worth a handshake?" "You used suggestion to push them to suicide," I said. Copley looked at me as if pitying a child. "Do you think it's so simple?" "No, I never said the words. I gave them choices, that's all." Holmes stepped forward. "You will surrender yourself now, or I will drag you from these walls like a rat from a drain." But Copley only smiled and stepped backward. Holmes lunged. Too late. The corridor echoed with the crash of wood as a hidden panel slammed shut between us and Copley vanished into the shadows. We ran, retracing our steps, but the labyrinth behind the walls was too complex. Holmes cursed under his breath as we emerged, breathless, into the light of the western wing. "We were too slow," he growled. "He knows every inch of this place." "But now we know the truth," I said. "He's alive. He's here. And you have his ledger." Holmes looked down at the notebook in his hand. "Yes, but a mind like Copley's will not flee in panic. He will double back. He will erase what remains." He turned to me with urgent intensity. "We must catch him before the next patient disappears." And with that, Holmes strode down the corridor, the hunt fully begun. Holmes moved with a focus I had only seen during his most intense pursuits. Every step through the stone corridors of Ravenscar Asylum echoed not only in sound but in resolve. The chase was no longer abstract. Maurice Copley, once a shadow, a whispered name, was flesh and blood. Dangerous, yes, but vulnerable now that Holmes had peeled back the veil. We returned to the administrative office where Dr. Pritchard waited anxiously. His face turned ashen the moment Holmes laid the thin black notebook on the desk. "It's worse than we feared," Holmes said, pacing. "He's not merely lurking in passages, he's orchestrating a psychological operation, one tailored to each patient's personal torment." Pritchard opened the notebook with trembling hands. These are detailed medical notes, more precise than our own records. He knew their histories. Holmes gave a grim nod. "And now that he knows he's exposed, he may try to erase the evidence, including those very patients." Pritchard looked up, panic creeping into his voice. "We must alert the night staff, double the watches." "Do so discreetly," Holmes replied. If Copley suspects we've drawn in reinforcements, he may accelerate whatever finale he's planned. We need to anticipate his next move. I cleared my throat. Holmes, you said something earlier, that Copley won't run. You believe he's still here? Holmes turned to me, his eyes narrowing. Not merely still here, Watson. I believe he's preparing his masterpiece. Copley was always theatrical. His illusions are precise, yes, but also grand. He doesn't simply want to escape, he wants to be remembered. He tapped the photograph of the boy, Leach's brother, still lying on the desk. Each victim received a gift, a vision of a past regret. He calls it closure. But I suspect he intends one final act, Watson. One so indelible that it burns his legacy into the very bones of this place. Pritchard leaned forward, voice hoarse. How do we stop him? Holmes didn't answer at once. He began pacing again, murmuring to himself. He needs access, privacy. The patients he's targeted are all isolated, discarded by society, given little notice by staff. But what if he turned his attention to someone unexpected? He stopped and turned slowly. Pritchard, who is your most recent admittance? The doctor blinked. Well, just this week, we admitted a young man, Alexander Mallaby, 24, former clerk, suffering episodes of hallucination and acute survivor's guilt. His fiancée died in a fire. He blames himself. He's fragile, but coherent. Perfect, Holmes muttered. Fresh trauma, unsettled memory. He's exactly the kind of target Copley would exploit for dramatic effect. Pritchard grew pale. You think he'll go after Mallaby next? Holmes didn't reply. He turned to me. Watson, you will pose as an orderly tonight. I want you stationed outside Mallaby's cell from midnight onward. Do not engage unless I give the signal. And you? I asked. I'll be inside, Holmes said simply. With Mallaby. That evening passed slowly, an unbearable weight wrapped in candlelight and whispered footsteps. At 11:45, I took my place at the end of the corridor in a borrowed uniform, hat pulled low. Holmes had already slipped into the cell with Mallaby, claiming he was conducting a psychological evaluation on Pritchard's behalf. The asylum was hushed, the air thick with anticipation. I leaned against the cold stone wall, heart thudding with each tick of the clock. At precisely 1:23, the gaslight nearest Mallaby's cell flickered. I straightened. A soft sound followed, barely audible, the shuffle of a shoe. Then silence. My fingers tightened around the revolver hidden in my coat. I moved forward, ever so slowly, and placed my ear against the door. Voices, two of them. Holmes and another, smoother one. Calmer, almost hypnotic in tone. You carry her death with you, don't you, Alexander? The voice said. But it wasn't your fault, you know that. A pause, then Mallaby's voice, weak, uncertain. She told me to stay. If I'd gone, she would still be alive, Copley's voice soothed. But you were late, not careless, you were afraid, and she forgave you. Would you like to hear her say it? Another pause. Mallaby whimpered. I can give you the moment again, Copley murmured. The last one. Her smile, her voice. One glimpse, and peace. I drew my revolver and raised my hand to knock. Then Holmes's voice rang out, sharp and sudden. Enough, Copley. Silence. Then a rustle of movement. Very clever, Copley said, his tone suddenly edged. Using the boy as bait. You gave yourself away, Holmes replied coolly. The emotional precision, the timing. You needed one last canvas, didn't you? Something grand enough to crown your legacy. You couldn't resist. You misunderstand, Copley said. This isn't about me. Spare me, Holmes snapped. You revel in control, in design. You didn't release them, you manipulated them. Their deaths were your compositions. Compositions? Copley laughed, soft, almost genuine. They were symphonies, each one struck in perfect key. Do you think I needed them to die? No, they chose it. I offered clarity. And what of Lavington? Holmes asked. He remembered you, didn't he? That's why you killed him. He was going to speak, Copley said, quieter now. He was about to break the spell. I had to preserve the myth. Without it, they suffer twice. Holmes's voice dropped. You never stopped performing. Even after the curtains fell, you just changed stages. A beat of silence passed. Then, You won't stop me, Copley said. The boy's ready. I saw it in his eyes. No, Holmes said. You're the one ready. The door flew open. I burst. In, revolver raised. Holmes stood in the centre of the cell, one hand gripping Copley's collar. The mesmerist's eyes were wild now, his calm mask shattered. Mallaby lay in the corner, dazed but alive. Holmes twisted and forced Copley to his knees. I saw your trap when I found the notebook, he said coldly. You returned to Lavington because he remembered your face. You couldn't risk exposure. You began revisiting others, ensuring no one else would connect the dream to the man. Copley laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You still don't understand. You're too logical, Holmes, too limited. They didn't want to live. I just helped them do it. Beautifully. You murdered them, I said, and now you'll answer for it. Holmes hauled him to his feet. No fog to vanish into now, Copley. The mesmerist's eyes lost their focus. They thanked me, Holmes, even Lavington. He smiled. And you mistook that for permission, Holmes muttered, when in truth it was relief that it was finally over. We delivered Copley to the police by dawn. The notebook, the photographs, and the hidden passages formed a case so airtight that even the most sceptical magistrate could not deny it. The patients who had survived, Leach among them, were slowly transferred to other facilities. Mallaby, spared the worst of it, was eventually released into the care of his sister. Holmes wrote a letter of recommendation on his behalf. A week later, as we sat once more by the fire at Baker Street, I set down my pen. So ends the tale of the man who shook hands with death, I said, quietly. Holmes didn't look up from his pipe. No, Watson, Copley never met death. He merely invited it. And what of the victims? I asked. What of their regrets? Holmes exhaled slowly. Regret is not something a man can be delivered from by another's hand. It must be faced, endured, not stolen away in the night like a lover's whisper. We sat in silence for a time, the fog brushing at the window panes, soft as memory. Holmes stirred only once more. I wonder, Watson, he said, how many others in the world would take that hand given the chance? I had no answer. And Holmes did not ask again. Some days passed in quiet reflection. The papers had caught wind of the affair at Ravenscar, but the truth, mercifully, was buried beneath official euphemism. A disturbance at a Yorkshire asylum was how the Times described it. A former hypnotist apprehended after unusual behaviour discovered amongst the patients. The full horror, the intricate design behind Maurice Copley's manipulations was known only to the few who had walked those dark corridors. Holmes made no effort to clarify it publicly. He rarely did. Truth, he remarked one afternoon while trimming a loose thread from his dressing gown, is often a surgical instrument. It must be applied with care or not at all. I had begun preparing my notes to file the case alongside others of our more disquieting adventures when a small square envelope arrived bearing no return address. Holmes opened it without comment and unfolded the stiff cream-coloured card within. He handed it to me after a moment, tapping the corner with a long forefinger. You were right. But some ghosts still leave footprints. There was no signature. Holmes said nothing. He merely turned back to the window and watched the smoke drift above the rooftops. I turned the card over. No watermark, no crest. The handwriting was neat and unremarkable. But I saw something in Holmes's face that startled me. Not concern, precisely, but an alertness, a tension that lingered just beneath the surface. "You believe it's from Copley?" I asked. Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, he's under constant supervision at Briarbank Jail, awaiting trial. There are no illusions left for him to cast." "Then who?" "I do not know," he replied. But the choice of words is curious. Ghosts, footprints, an acknowledgement perhaps that not all damage vanishes with the man who caused it. A week later, we received another visitor. It was late morning, and I had just returned from my rounds at the practice when Mrs. Hudson showed in a young woman. She was plainly dressed but not poor, with auburn hair pinned back neatly, and a nervousness she failed to disguise. "Miss Catherine Elmes," she said, with a faint curtsy. Holmes rose only slightly, waved her to the chair opposite, and resumed smoking. "Miss Elmes, how may we assist you?" "I came about Josiah Lavington," she said, glancing toward me. At once, Holmes's manner shifted, just subtly, but enough for me to notice. He leaned forward. "You knew him?" "Yes, years ago," she replied. "We were engaged to be married." I sat down opposite her. "Then I believe you were the woman in the photograph found among his things at Ravenscar?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I only learned of his death recently, and of his confinement." "You did not know he had been institutionalized?" I asked gently. "No," she said, her voice tight. "We had a quarrel. I left Lincolnshire and moved south to care for my mother. I assumed he had moved on." She swallowed. "But last week I received a letter. It had no return address. Inside was a page torn from a book of poems, our favorite book. A line was underlined. No distance of place or lapse of time can lessen the friendship of those who are thoroughly persuaded of each other's worth." Holmes stirred. "And why did this bring you to us?" "Because the handwriting," she said softly, "was his." Holmes's pipe stilled. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Quite," she said. "I'd know his hand anywhere. The last time I saw it was in a note he left on my windowsill before I left town." I never answered it. She reached into her handbag and drew out a slip of paper, folded 3 times. Holmes took it carefully and studied it under the gaslight. "It is Lavington's writing," he said at last. "And yet it must have been posted after his death." "Which is impossible," I said, frowning. "Unless it was something he wrote long ago, kept hidden, and mailed by someone else." Holmes looked thoughtful. "A message delayed, or deliberately timed." He turned to Miss Elmes. "Did anyone else know of your engagement?" "No one except my mother, and she passed away 2 years ago. It was a quiet thing. We hadn't yet made it public." "Then the sender of this letter had access not only to Lavington's past, but to his personal writings, perhaps even his memory." Holmes rose and crossed to the shelf where he kept certain personal files, scrapbooks of the more unusual aspects of his cases. From a thin folder he withdrew one of Copley's earlier advertisements from his stage days, M. Copley, the man who sees what you regret. Holmes tapped it lightly. This was his selling point even then, not the illusion of spirits, but the recreation of memory. If he found Lavington's letters in the asylum, it would have been simplicity itself to send one post-mortem to create an echo. Miss Elmes looked ill. Why would he do that? Holmes regarded her carefully. Because regret is a fertile soil. He may be gone now, but what he planted remains. She shivered. "So you believe—" "What?" "That this is some final cruelty?" Holmes said nothing at first. Then softly, "Or perhaps it was not cruelty at all. Perhaps it was meant as a strange sort of kindness, I started. Holmes, you don't suggest? No, he said quickly. Copley's methods were grotesque, but even monsters perform acts of theatre. This could have been his final flourish, a reconciliation never made in life, handed back as a gift through the post. Miss Elms stood. I don't know what to make of it, but I thought you should see it. You were right to bring it, Holmes said. And Miss Elms, Josiah remembered you. Of that I am certain, and I believe it brought him peace at the last. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. After she had gone, Holmes stood motionless by the window, his fingers drumming silently against the sill. You don't believe it was a coincidence? I said. No, Holmes replied. Copley knew what he was doing. Even in chains he knew. Then this is not over? Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. Oh, it is over, Watson, but the echoes may take longer to fade. He picked up the slip of paper once more, rereading the line of poetry. No distance of place or lapse of time. Then he struck a match and, without hesitation, fed the letter into the fire. We watched it curl into ash. Not a word more was spoken, but that night, as I prepared for bed, I found a folded note slipped into the pocket of my coat. It bore no name, only one line written in a strong, decisive hand. He never lied. The hand was cold. And I could not say why, but I left it untouched in my drawer, unopened by fire, unread by others, because some echoes, once heard, do not wish to be silenced. In the days that followed, Holmes resumed his usual routine, or so it appeared. He read the papers, experimented with various chemical reactions in his corner, and once spent an entire afternoon calculating the optimal trajectory for a thrown horseshoe in adverse wind conditions. But beneath that thin veil of eccentric calm, I sensed the undercurrents of lingering disquiet. Holmes was not a man to dwell on the past. He dissected it, catalogued it, learned from it, but he rarely allowed it to disturb his sleep. This was different. The note I had discovered in my coat still lay in the drawer by my bedside. Holmes had neither asked after it nor acknowledged its existence, but I was certain he knew. There had been a subtle glance, no more than a flick of his eyes, when I re-entered the sitting-room that evening, coat folded too carefully under my arm. Holmes noticed everything. We were deep into a discussion of an entirely unrelated matter, a jewel theft in Chiswick, when a knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, balancing a tray and a telegram. "For you, Mr. Holmes, the boy said it was marked urgent." Holmes took the envelope and opened it quickly. His eyes scanned the page once, then again. Then he stood. "We're going back to Ravenscar," he said. I looked up from the folder of notes in my lap. "Back? What's happened?" He handed me the telegram. Dr. Pritchard gravely injured, found unconscious in his study, one patient missing, identical signs to prior events, come at once. Nurse Corrick? I rose immediately. "Another patient taken?" Holmes had already begun collecting his coat and gloves. "So it appears. But this time Copley is in custody, which means either someone is continuing his work or someone never stopped." The journey north was grim and clouded, as though the very skies mirrored the sense of unease. Holmes remained silent the entire way, his eyes fixed not on the scenery, but on something inward and unreadable. When we arrived at the asylum, the change was evident. Guards had been posted at the gate. The atmosphere, always heavy, now felt leaden. Nurse Corrick met us inside, her face drawn and pale. "He's alive," she said at once, leading us toward the infirmary. "Dr. Pritchard, I mean, but barely. They believe he was struck from behind with a blunt object, a heavy glass paperweight from his desk. Nothing was taken. His key ring was found on the floor." "And the missing patient?" Holmes asked. Henry Lowell, mid-30s, quiet, former printer's apprentice, committed after a breakdown, some talk of lost family, but details were sparse. He vanished from his locked cell, just like the others. We found Pritchard, in a bed, his head heavily bandaged. He was conscious, though clearly in pain. His voice was weak, but insistent. "I never saw you, never heard anyone enter," he murmured. "Just a pain in the back of my head. Then nothing." Holmes leaned over him gently. "Did you recently admit anyone new? Any unusual visitors? Staff changes?" Pritchard shook his head slowly. "No new admissions this week, but wait. There was one visitor, yesterday, a man asking to see Copley." Holmes stiffened. "Did he give a name?" "Burton. James Burton. Said he was an attorney, had documentation." "Did you verify it?" Pritchard looked ashamed. "He had the correct papers, but I didn't check closely." Holmes stood. "This visitor may be our link. It's possible Copley had an accomplice, or a disciple." We made immediately for the cell where Copley was being held. It was not far from the old western wing, but newly reinforced and watched by a warder who seemed appropriately wary. The man rose as we approached. "He's quiet, sir. Been sitting like that since morning." Inside, Copley sat cross-legged on his cot, his eyes closed, face blank. "Mr. Copley," Holmes said sharply. The mesmerist opened his eyes. He smiled. "Mr. Holmes, I had a feeling you'd return. Things unresolved tend to pull you back, don't they?" Holmes stepped forward. "Who is James Burton?" A flicker passed across Copley's face, almost imperceptible. "You'll have to be more specific." "Don't be coy," Holmes snapped. "Someone came here yesterday with forged documents, visited you. Shortly after, Pritchard was attacked and a patient disappeared." Copley leaned forward slightly, his voice soft. "Did it ever occur to you, Holmes, that people want what I offer, that even confined, I'm still listened to more than you?" "I'm not here for philosophy," Holmes growled. "What was discussed during that visit?" Copley's smile returned. "Legacy, Mr. Holmes, the same as always." Holmes turned on his heel and left. In the hallway he paced with quick, purposeful steps. "He's playing a deeper game," he muttered. "That visit wasn't to coordinate a plan, it was to pass a message, a code, or a name." "A disciple, then?" I asked. "Someone continuing the work?" "Not just a disciple," Holmes said. "A partner, someone who believes in the work." We spent the rest of the day interrogating staff, reviewing visitor logs, and searching the grounds for any sign of Henry Lowell. It wasn't until dusk that Holmes requested to revisit the hidden passages, the secret route behind the cell walls. This time, I led. We knew the way now. The dust seemed disturbed, recent movement. We followed the passage until it opened into one of the old storage rooms, long abandoned. Holmes raised the lantern, and there in the dust were footprints, bare, fresh, leading to a cabinet set into the wall. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside lay a single item, a glass paperweight, its base crusted with dried blood. "Used on Pritchard," Holmes muttered. "Then hidden here, by someone who knew these tunnels." He turned to me, his voice low. "This disciple of Copley's is not an outsider. They're part of the staff." He crouched, studying the dust again. "These prints, too narrow for a man. The stride is small, slight." He stood. "We're not looking for a man at all." That night, as the asylum settled into uneasy silence, Holmes assembled the staff in the infirmary lounge, ostensibly to review protocol. But I knew the look in his eye. He was laying a trap. He addressed them firmly, but not accusingly. Then he asked the final question. "Who was on the floor when Pritchard was attacked?" Only one person raised their hand. Nurse Corrick. She met Holmes's gaze without flinching. "I was," she said simply. "I found him." Holmes took a step toward her. "And when did you first meet Maurice Copley?" Her face remained still. "In 1887, she replied. Silence swept the room. Holmes's voice was ice. "You studied under him, didn't you?" She said nothing. Holmes continued. "You were there at his London performances, a volunteer. He trained you, not as a patient, not as an assistant, but as a pupil. And when the stage fell silent, you followed him into the shadows." Nurse Corrick finally smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, just tiredly. "They were suffering," she said. "He showed me how to help them let go." "You murdered them," Holmes said. "No," she replied. "I guided them. He gave them the truth. I gave them the choice." The guard stepped forward, but Holmes held up his hand. "Tell me where Henry Lowell is," he said. She looked at me, then back to Holmes. "He's safe," she whispered. "He chose not to go, that's why I stopped. That's why I left the paperweight. I knew it was over." They took her away quietly. Holmes remained seated for a long time after. He lit his pipe with care, then spoke only once before we left the asylum for the final time. "It is a terrifying thing, Watson," he said, "when someone wraps mercy in the robes of death and calls it kindness." And he said no more. We left Ravenscar the next morning under an overcast sky, the asylum receding behind us like a dream half-remembered, chilling in its immediacy but already slipping into something hazier, something the mind shies from revisiting in full. Holmes was silent for much of the journey back to London, his fingers steepled beneath his chin and his eyes half-lidded as though asleep. But I knew he was not resting. His mind was occupied, still tightening the final threads of a case that, unlike so many others, had not ended with the clatter of handcuffs or the applause of justice cleanly served. It had ended in ambiguity, in choices made in silence, in motives that defied strict categories of guilt and innocence. For my part, I felt a strange hollowness settle in my chest, not from fear nor anger, but from the heavy sense that what we had confronted at Ravenscar was not merely a human crime, but a symptom of something larger and more profoundly unsettling. It was early afternoon when we returned to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson had just placed tea in the sitting room, and we both sat in the familiar warmth with a sense of dislocation, as though, after days of haunting corridors and secret tunnels, we had to reorient ourselves to the sane and solid world again. "Lowell will recover," Holmes said at last, pouring the tea. "He resisted, that's what mattered." "Yes," I replied, "but I wonder if he will ever quite forget what he saw, or what was offered to him." Holmes nodded slowly. "That's the cruelty of it, Watson. Once a man sees the shape of his own regret, it never vanishes entirely, it lingers, it waits. And some will always return to it, even if they know it is a phantom." He did not touch his tea. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a slip of paper, creased from handling. I recognized it at once. The note I had found in my own coat pocket days earlier. He never lied. The hand was cold. "I believe Nurse Corrick left this for you," Holmes said. "A final reassurance, or perhaps a final invitation." "I don't understand," I said. Holmes looked at me with quiet intensity. "Corrick was no mere accomplice, Watson. She believed in what Copley had created, believed in it so deeply that she found a kind of truth in it. For her, the cold hand was not a metaphor. It was a threshold, one that offered release." "You believe she intended to pass the role to me?" I asked, feeling a strange unease settle over me. "No," Holmes said softly. "But she wanted you to understand. You were always the conscience in these affairs, and perhaps she wanted yours to tremble. I sat back, the paper still in my hands. It was so simple, so final. "Will Copley be tried?" I asked, after a long moment. Holmes's expression turned guarded. "He has been declared unfit for the dock, too unstable to answer for his actions. He will remain under high security at Briarbank for the remainder of his life." "And Corrick?" "She'll be tried for attempted murder, unlawful confinement and conspiracy, but I suspect her defence will lean heavily on diminished responsibility. Pritchard survived. That may weigh in her favour." I shook my head. She believed she was doing good. Holmes exhaled through his nose. And so did Copley. For several days we returned to our usual rhythm. A burglary in Belgravia, a forgery scheme unravelled in Paddington, cases with clear beginnings and satisfying ends. But there was something in Holmes that remained elsewhere. His violin, which he normally played only in moods of deep introspection or melancholy, found its way into his hands more often. Late one evening, I found him at the window, bow suspended mid-air, the last tremor of a mournful E-string fading into the floorboards. "There's something still unresolved," he said, his back to me. I stepped into the room. "You mean the accomplice?" He turned. "No, I mean Burton." I blinked. "The name used by Copley's mysterious visitor?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "I had Mycroft run the name through several registers. No such attorney applied for access to Briarbank on the day in question, and yet someone was allowed in, someone who knew the old signals, someone trusted." I felt a chill pass through me. "Another disciple?" Holmes nodded. "Or something worse." The next day Holmes left early. He told me nothing of his destination, only that he had an inquiry to complete. He returned that evening with a thin envelope and a face drawn tighter than I had seen since we first descended into Ravenscar's gloom. "I was right," he said, slumping into his armchair. "The man who visited Copley was not a stranger. He was a former patient." My eyebrows rose. "A patient? But how—" "He was transferred from another institution, released 5 years ago under the name James Burton, formerly Edwin Vale." The name rang no bells. "He was a witness, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "One of the early ones, one of the first to speak of the cold hand. He recovered, at least outwardly. But it seems he never let go of what he saw, or of who showed it to him." "You think he was, what, trying to carry on the work?" "I think he wants to, and I think Copley knew it." Holmes passed me a second note, torn from what looked like a medical file. In faded ink, a message had been scribbled across the margin. "Burton sees what I saw. He knows how to guide them now. I showed him the path. He will walk it longer than I can." I stared at the page. "It's Copley's hand." "Yes," Holmes said. "And it means that even though we closed the door on the asylum, we did not close the door on the idea." I was quiet for a moment. "What do we do?" Holmes placed his hands on the arms of his chair. "We wait. We watch. There are no fingerprints on a whisper, Watson. No knife to trace when the wound is made from within." He stood and crossed to the hearth, gazing into the fire. "But when the hand reaches again, I will be watching." That night, as the streets of London stretched dark and cold beneath our window, I sat down at my desk and began to write the final lines of the case I would title "The Man Who Shook Hands with Death." But I could not bring myself to write the word end, not yet, because somewhere, perhaps in another institution, in another dim hallway lined with locked doors, a man waits. He is calm. He is smiling. He knows exactly what regret haunts you, and he is reaching out his hand. It was early spring when I finished the last page of my account and placed it in the locked drawer of my desk. Outside, the world had already begun to stir with renewal. Buds on the trees, the smell of wet soil in the parks, and a faint, golden warmth creeping into the London mornings. Yet within the walls of 221B Baker Street, a different kind of season lingered. Something colder, something left behind. Holmes had changed, not in any overt way. He still rose before dawn, still devoured the agony columns for scent trails of intrigue, still filled the flat with noxious chemical fumes that sent Mrs. Hudson scowling into retreat. But there was a slowness now, a tension in the way he would sometimes pause with a vial in hand, or linger too long at the window, his eyes fixed not on the street below, but on something further, something unseen. One morning, as he stood there in silence while the kettle whistled madly behind him, I could no longer remain quiet. "You still expect him to reappear, don't you?" I asked. Holmes didn't turn. "Burton?" "Yes." "It's been 6 weeks," I said. "No incidents, no disappearances, not even a whisper." "Precisely why I remain alert," he replied. "He's not a creature of haste. He will strike when the world has forgotten him again." "But how?" I pressed. "What is he truly? Another mesmerist? A deluded protégé, or simply a madman?" Holmes turned at last. "He is a mirror, Watson, a mirror polished by Copley and angled at the world. And like any mirror, he reflects only what stands in front of him. That is what makes him dangerous. He does not invent grief, he reveals it." He sat, fingertips steepled, and stared at the hearth. "He will not return with blood or fire. He will return with regret, one whisper at a time." That very day a letter arrived. It bore the insignia of Briarbank Jail and was addressed in a loose, sprawling hand to Sherlock Holmes. Holmes opened it slowly, as if already suspecting what lay within. "To Mr. Holmes, the man you pursued is no longer with us. Maurice Copley was found dead in his cell at sunrise. No sign of violence, no trauma. His expression was peaceful. There was only this note left beside him. He came to me too, in the end. I was not spared the hand, only delayed." There was no signature. The prison physician had signed the rest of the letter with the requisite formality, but Holmes barely glanced at the name. He folded the paper once, then again, and placed it into the fire. We watched it burn. "It's begun," Holmes said quietly. I shifted in my chair. "Then it never ended?" He nodded. "Not truly." That evening, Holmes was invited to dine with Mycroft at the Diogenes Club. He accepted with the curious resignation of a man going not to a meal, but to a necessary confession. He returned late, coat dusted with fog, expression unreadable. I rose from the settee. "Did he believe you?" Holmes removed his gloves. "He always believes me, Watson. He just prefers not to act until it's too late." The next morning brought a visitor. She arrived without appointment and without hesitation. A woman in her late 30s, plainly dressed, her eyes shadowed by long nights and haunted thoughts. She introduced herself as Mrs. Eliza Corwin. "I read about your cases, Mr. Holmes," she said. I need your help. I believe someone is trying to kill my son." Holmes studied her closely. "Tell me everything." She sat with hands folded tight, as if wringing them would extract the words. "My son George has been unwell since the fire. 6 months ago, our house in Devonshire burned. He escaped. His father did not. Since then, George has not been the same. He speaks of seeing his father again. He says he hears him in dreams. But last week?" She stopped, swallowing. "Last week, he said a man visited him in the night. A man with cold hands and a calm voice. A man who said he could bring George back to the moment, back to the house before the fire started. That if George wanted, he could go back and stop it. I sat forward. Did he describe the man? She nodded. Tall, thin, dressed in grey. He called him Mr. Burton. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. Then he stood. You'll take us to your son. Tonight. The house in Devonshire was a modest place, surrounded by high hedgerows and the persistent rustle of coastal wind. Young George was no more than 14, a pale, thin boy with eyes far too old for his face. He greeted us politely, but without emotion. Holmes asked to speak with him alone. They talked for an hour. When Holmes emerged, he said nothing at first, only sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped before him. He's clever, Holmes said, observant, and he saw someone. This Burton is not a dream. What did he offer? I asked. Holmes looked at me, and for the first time in a long while, I saw genuine anger in his eyes. He offered to let the boy watch his father not burn. We stayed in the house that night. Holmes insisted. George was to sleep in the study, with Holmes keeping watch inside, and myself positioned outside the hall. The house was silent until 3:27 a.m. A creak, a whisper, a movement too deliberate to be the wind. I stood and opened the door. There, at the end of the corridor, stood a man in grey. Holmes stepped silently behind him. You're not a ghost, Holmes said. The figure turned, slowly, calmly. Neither are you, he replied. Burton, if that's the name you prefer. Holmes stepped closer. This ends now. Burton shook his head. No, Mr. Holmes, this continues, because pain continues. You think you stopped the work at Ravenscar, but you only scattered the seeds. He smiled, not cruelly, not kindly. Would you have denied the boy one last moment with his father? Yes, Holmes said coldly. Because memory is not truth. It is only a reflection, and your mirror is warped. Burton didn't resist when Holmes reached for him. But there was no fear in his eyes, only certainty. You'll never stop us all, he said. We don't work in light, we work in regret, and there is no cell for that. They took him away. The next morning, George was quiet, distant. But something had changed. When I asked if the man had visited again, he only said, I heard him, but I didn't listen. It was enough. As we rode back to London, Holmes leaned against the window. Did we succeed, Holmes? I asked. No, he said. But we did interrupt. And that's enough? For now, he said, because darkness only needs one interruption to falter, one candle, one choice made in resistance. That's where victory lives, not in total vanquishing, but in refusal. I looked out the window. The fog was rising again, but so was the sun. And though we did not speak again that day, I knew Holmes was already waiting for the next whisper, because the man who shakes hands with death has many names, and Sherlock Holmes would learn them all. The days that followed Burton's arrest passed with a peculiar stillness, as though some great pressure, one we hadn't noticed fully until it was gone, had lifted from the air. Yet neither Holmes nor I celebrated. There were no toasts, no triumphant summaries delivered in our sitting room. It was not that the case lacked resolution, it had, in its way, concluded, but rather that the nature of its victory was not one of conquest but containment. Burton was remanded to a secure facility pending evaluation. His behaviour, though calm, baffled the physicians assigned to him. He confessed readily to his actions, described them without remorse, even claimed that more would come. And when asked why, he simply replied, because grief listens. Holmes attended the first hearing only briefly. I found him in the gallery, arms folded, gaze flat. As Burton was led out, their eyes met. Holmes did not speak. He didn't need to. Later, as we walked through the quiet London streets, I asked, "Do you believe him, that others will follow?" "I believe," Holmes replied, that every idea breeds consequence. Copley created a philosophy masquerading as mercy. Burton refined it into a practice, and somewhere, Watson, someone else will try to perfect it. He paused beneath a lamp-post and looked up. But they'll find me waiting. We resumed our walk, neither of us speaking for some time. I could feel the weight of the case settling into memory, but also the persistent echo of its deeper question, how far the human mind will go to rewrite what it cannot endure. Back at Baker Street, Holmes removed a box from the shelf above the mantel, old, walnut, and rarely opened. Inside it were fragments of past investigations, a cipher from the affair of the Emerald Rook, a pressed flower from the widow of Montfort Hall, a chipped glass button from a case long forgotten. To this Holmes now added something new. The final photograph recovered from Ravenscar, one that had not belonged to any patient and bore no inscription. It showed a figure from behind, seated at the edge of a lake, water still as glass. The solitude of it was haunting. "You never identified that one," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "I suspect it was Copley himself, or what he imagined peace to look like." He closed the lid gently. "I've always considered my work a battle against chaos," he said. "But this case reminded me it is also a battle against seduction, the seduction of escape, the lie that tells us we can undo what's done." He looked at me then, and for once his eyes did not carry detachment or intellectual fire. They carried weariness, and something close to sorrow. "We can't offer them what Copley did," I said quietly. "The illusion, the soft ending." "No," Holmes replied, "but we can offer the truth. And the truth, Watson, endures, even if it does not comfort." That night, as the fire burned low and the world outside blurred into rain against the window, I finished the final line of my account and set down my pen. It was not a story of justice in the conventional sense. It was a story of choice, of grief, of the delicate, terrible gift of memory. But above all, it was a story of a man, a singular man who stood time and again between the world and the shadows that sought to rewrite it. Sherlock Holmes never shook hands with death. He simply watched, measured, and refused, and for that we are all better.